This is a unique experience for me, but I think the events of the last few days and hours are a unique experience for everybody. None of us can remember, I think, an occasion of such extraordinary events happening. But what we're going to try and do is look a little bit behind them and say, is this just a political crisis, or is there a larger crisis, a moral, a spiritual crisis going on? And of course, we'll have to ask whether Boris Johnson should have become Prime Minister in the first place, given what people knew then about his character and what we've seen subsequently. We've got four very distinguished people to talk to with us to offer their views on these issues. Dr Claire Foster-Gilbert is director of the Westminster Abbey Institute. Professor Chris Baker is from the Faith and Civil Society Unit at Goldsmiths. He's also William Temple Professor of Religion and Belief in Public Life. Bishop John Arnold is the Roman Catholic Bishop of Salford. And of course, Boris Johnson is a Roman Catholic. And the Bishop of Manchester, David Walker, who this week, Bishop, has been the duty bishop in the House of Lords, leading prayers. What sort of prayers have you been reading?
Well, most of the prayers are the state prayers that are read every day in Parliament. So the prayer for the Queen, the prayer for the royal family. But the prayer for Parliament, that's a particularly important one, praying that we may do our work without prejudice or partiality. But then each day I get to pick a psalm. There's a selection of psalms in the parliamentary prayer book, and I get to pick a psalm. And so I've been trying to find psalms that will help members to understand something of the situation that we find ourselves in, and our appeal to God in the rather peculiar context that we find ourselves at this time. And prayers are an important part of parliamentary life.
But did you think, sorry to interrupt you, did you also think it was your job to offer advice? Was it your job to listen, to offer prayers, or did you need to go further than that and make a judgment yourself on the situation?
It hasn't been my job to offer formal advice to anybody. It so happens I've been working as one does when one's on duty with a number of ministers on matters of mutual interest over the course of the week. And I put out on Twitter this morning that every single minister I'd met in a meeting in the week had resigned by this morning, which sort of slightly puts the purpose of those meetings in retrospect into a different light. But I've not been offering advice. It's not for me to offer advice.
Now, why isn't it for you? I mean, if you believe that this isn't simply a crisis within the Conservative Party or a crisis for the country politically faced with the external problems we face and cost of living and whatever, if we think this is also a crisis about behaviour, about morality in politics, why are you not offering advice?
Well, I will speak about morality in public life, and I've spoken about morality in public life considerably over my time as Bishop of Manchester and before. I think it's important in these circumstances not to personalise it, and in the particular context of this week, to avoid making comments that could be seen to be simply saying Boris must go or Boris must stay. I think there's a place for the church is to offer advice of a slightly more general nature. And again, I think the psalms, the prayers that we say, they are advice.
Well, some would say you're ducking out here. I mean, on the one hand, people will not want you to tell the country who should be Prime Minister, and they quite understand that. That's not your job. On the other hand, people will say you can't just stick here with generalities. Here we have a Prime Minister who is a proven liar. It's a terrible thing to say, but it's true. And the doubts about his character, to put it politely, have been there consistently. And there have been a list of events in which his own cabinet ministers now believe they cannot believe what he says. Is the church going to stick with generalities and not be specific in these circumstances?
I think what we found this week is that the system has worked, and increasingly during the course of the week.
We're talking about leadership. We're talking about moral and spiritual leadership here, not whether we're going to replace the Prime Minister or who will replace them, but whether the church has a role in commenting when it is clearly the case that a Prime Minister lied.
Well, I think that a number of bishops have commented, including myself, on the Prime Minister's behaviour in the past. I think this week the danger of things being counterproductive, of simply looking as though the church was party pre on a matter where we're not. I think we do give advice. We talk to our own members of Parliament in our dioceses. We talk to friends and colleagues. I don't think anyone will doubt the views of church leaders on integrity in public life, and I'm happy to talk about that in general terms. But I think I'm not sure it would have been apposite this week to have kind of somehow led calls for the Prime Minister to go.
But again, just pursuing a last question to you, it's easy to talk about integrity in public life in general terms. It's like saying, do we all like apple pie? Of course we do. The difficulty is then looking at when politicians have to make very difficult decisions between often, very conflicting arguments and so on. Whether the use of the word integrity is appropriate and where it's appropriate. And I haven't got a sense from you yet where you think it's appropriate. One would have thought, or some would think, that when the cabinet doesn't believe it can trust its prime minister, can't believe what the prime minister's spokesman says happened on something, that is an issue of integrity on which you would expect the church to speak out.
Well, I think there's a couple of things around that. Firstly, I say there's no doubt that the church does speak out and speak out regularly on these issues. And secondly, that in the course of this week, we've seen a number of conversations have been made public that took place before the Prime Minister resigned by some ministers. A lot of conversations also take place in private, and I think there's a proper place for giving advice or having conversations in private as well as in public.
Can I move now to Bishop John Arnold, the Roman Catholic Bishop of Salford? Thank you very much for agreeing to take part within us. What do you think is the appropriate role of the Church in these circumstances? Do you share the view of Bishop David that you must talk in general terms and then speak privately on, if you like, individual issues? Or do you think you need to speak out more publicly on this specific issue of whether the Prime Minister could have been trusted to tell the truth?
Well, I'm largely in agreement with Bishop Walker. For me, the Church teaches truth, honesty, integrity, and that is something that I have to teach in my ministry. What's happening in Parliament is largely to do with parliamentary structures, and it's very important, I think, that we don't assume things. It does appear that certainly there's a lot of evidence, but I don't know it all, that the Prime Minister has not been truthful in a number of ways. But there are ways in which that needs to be dealt with in Parliament by members of his party and by the structures that surround our political system. And I think that's what's in trouble at the moment, is that we seem to have lost a lot of those principles. But maybe this is the real occasion when we restructure those principles and we get back to that sense of honesty and transparency in what happens in Parliament. And it's clearly seen that politicians are working according to agreed standards, high standards, which it would appear, and I don't know all the information, but it would appear that they've been compromised very badly in recent times.
How are we going to do that, though? I mean, we have an unwritten constitution, which depends. I mean, I think the historian Peter Hennessy used the phrase, good chaps. We depend on good chaps who basically do the right thing. That's why, and because we look at the United States and we can see there are particular problems with written constitutions, but we are dependent on people acting honourably. Many think this is not happening now. You yourself have raised real concerns about the way things are going. So what needs to happen, and what's the role the Church can play in ensuring that the highest standards of integrity are applied in public life?
Well, I think we've got to speak out about the importance of truth in all things, that there has to be confidentiality, certainly, but we've got to be sure that there are those and require that there are those structures in place by which people are held to account if there is a question that there is untruth, that people are lying, that people are covering things up. And I think that there are mechanisms within Parliament which seem to be working reasonably well for a long time, but need to be revisited and reinforced now because of what we've seen in recent months.
Do you think that this is perhaps an unfair question to put to to you, but I'll put it anyway. Do you think that the Church of England suffers from the fact that it is part of the establishment? It has bishops in the House of Lords. It is, to an extent, compromised by power, or could be. Therefore, that you in the Roman Catholic Church, standing just slightly outside of that, have a sort of freer opportunity to speak out. You're not compromised in the same way. You're not a member of the establishment in the same way that the Church of England is.
Yes, I think there's two things to that. That those spiritual lords, the bishops who sit in the House of Lords, are not in the House of Commons. That's the important thing. The House of Lords has a different way of debating things. They have a different membership that calls on all sorts of experience and expertise, and they must bring the gospel and what they believe to the debates in the House of Lords. Perhaps by standing outside the political system, maybe we've got a greater freedom in the Catholic Church. I hope that we use it properly, in that we are trying to promote our faith. But within that, we're trying to promote truth and goodness, which I hope is common to all faiths, and that there is a role for us in interfaith dialogue and those qualities which I think all world faiths hold together and promote. And so, yes, I'm happy that there should be bishops of England, in Church of England in the House of Lords. I don't think it should constrain them at all in speaking out on the principles in which we believe.
But I think a lot of people, again, would say you are prepared to speak out in general. You are so reluctant to speak out in particular, the result of which is that, you sometimes seem to be saying things which you could be saying at any time, in any circumstances, but not which is particular to the crisis that we're dealing with. Now, nobody wants you to play politics and say, if you've got to be a Christian, you've got to vote socialist or whatever. They don't want you to play that, but they do look to you for leadership when they believe, and when there seems to be sufficient evidence, that the highest standards in public life are not being adhered to in government. Do you think you need more courage to speak out on such things, or are you still reluctant because you feel you might not know enough?
I'm not going to judge other people's opinions and make judgments for them. What I am prepared to do is to speak out about the need for truth, accountability, transparency, and that where those principles are not being properly observed, that we need to correct things, revise our structures, and make sure that things are happening well according to my gospel values. But I don't think I can say directly on issues. I shouldn't intrude on other people's freedom to think and to judge and to act as they believe is right. But I do want them to have the right information and the right structures in which to make those decisions.
Can I bring now in Professor Chris Baker of the Faith and Civil Society Unit at Goldsmiths? Professor, do you see this as essentially a political crisis that we're going through at the moment, or do you think there's also a wider crisis about integrity in public life, that this isn't just a one-off?
Thank you. Yes, I do think this is more than a political crisis. And in order to respond to your line of questioning so far, I think we're at a particularly interesting point in our history as a nation and the world, which does have a precedent. So we're at a point of multiple crises, environmental, economic, war, and there was a similar situation. This country was facing a similar situation in the 1940s, which was the platform upon which Archbishop William Temple, who was possibly one of the, with great due respect to today, Bishop David, undoubtedly one of the greatest Anglican social thinkers we've had. So he said, in order to meet these kind of multiple crises, we first of all have to decide what sort of society we want to be. He had this rather quaint, old-fashioned term of social order. What is the social order that we want to build so that we no longer are confronted with totalitarianism and the sort of economic crises that drive people to populism and totalitarianism? Otherwise, if we don't go upstream in that way, we'll have another, world war in 20 years' time. And his solution to this problem was the creation of what he called the welfare state. So he used his position of leadership, you could say, in the public square to articulate not only what the social order should be, which he based very squarely on principles of God's love for all creation, us being made in the image of God, so each person carries within them the imago Dei. Therefore, the political consensus and impetus must be to create a society where, as far as we can, that essential God-given spark in every human being is valued and respected. And out of that, he developed, as you know, the principles for the welfare state, which Beveridge went on to deliver in terms of the policy document, because unfortunately Temple died in 1944. And he said, if you want to create a society which reflects the image of God in every person and is in accordance with the principles of God, then the role of the state is to provide the basic building blocks for human flourishing. So that's lifelong education, decent healthcare, decent rights at work. So very broad, what he called middle axioms, very broad areas of policy.
I think most of the politicians in most of the parties would sign up to that. Now, you can argue about whether they, wholeheartedly believe it, but would sign up to that view of society. What you're not dealing with is the conduct and the question of integrity with which, if you like, politicians carry out those things. Are you arguing that actually for a particular set of policies, or are you arguing that actually, or should we be arguing that what matters almost as much of the policies is the integrity of those who are entrusted with carrying them out?
I think it's both, because what Temple went on to define was, those issues and principles of integrity. What he called political citizenship. The role of a person of faith is to live out those principles in their own life and to expect those principles to be lived out in public life as well. And just to come back to your earlier line of questioning, Roger, if you read Christianity and Social Order, where he lays out all these principles, he spends the first third of that book asking the question, why should the church interfere? And I think the word you were looking for in your earlier questioning was interference. The church should interfere. The church has the right to interfere where it sees society, the social order, not fulfilling the principles of God. Because he said that the main role of the main function of the church as the body of Christ, and you could argue this for other faith groups as well, is to draw attention and remind people, and where necessary, exercise leadership so that society bends itself towards broad principles, God-given principles.
But again, if I say, I don't think you will find many people in Westminster who would disagree with you. And I think both the bishops we've talked to would, of course, be 100% with you about saying that the poor must be at the front of what we think, that Christianity is about society as a whole, that we're all part of that, and of course would agree with you that none of us is better than another. We're all made in the image of God. That is an argument about our general approach to policy, if you like, and responsibility, but again doesn't deal with this issue of whether at the moment there is a growing gap, if you like, in trust. There obviously is between the electorate and those who lead us, that trust is ultimately dangerous, but to a degree that distrust is justified. And if it is, what are we going to do about it? And as we were talking earlier, what is the role of bishops and leaders, religious leaders, to help us with that? Do you think, therefore, it's a policy issue and a reorientation of policy? Or do you think there's something wider going on, a sort of spiritual malaise at the top?
I think undoubtedly there's a spiritual malaise at the top of politics. I think we're in a broken society, and the reason why we're broken is because we've, the last few decades, exercised public life in complete, absence of a sense of guiding values and virtues and principles. That we should do it.
If you accept that analysis, it's a comment on the failure of the church, isn't it?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it may be a comment on the direction of travel of successive governments, but I think all we can do is continue to make the case for integrity in public life as we do. And indeed, I think on Tuesday afternoon, when there was a statement in the Lords on standards in public life. The Bishop of Leeds asked one of the supplementary questions on that in a fairly pointed way. So I think we're continuing to engage to promote the highest possible standards in public life. I think one of the changes, it's interesting what brought the Nolan Commission about, which was really when I think Margaret Thatcher had been bringing people in from other walks of life who hadn't all been educated at the same handful of public schools and the same 2 universities. And they realised they had to actually write some things down that perhaps before it was assumed that, yes, good chaps, as it was in those days, simply had imbibed from prep school onwards. And I think what we're seeing now is an example in government of if there are not, I guess, some politicians who think if there's not an absolute rule that says you cannot do this, then you can do this. Anything that is not absolutely outlawed specifically is lawful and proper to do. And what the Nolan Commission, the Nolan principles were trying to do was to get underneath that and say, no, we can't entirely have a rule-based society. We have to have values-based societies, and these are some of the values. And I think what we got at the moment is a crisis of values where people, when they don't accept the values, default down to very specific rules. And particularly, if it is not illegal, then I can do it. And we saw that in the Expenser scandal some while ago, and I think we've seen it again very much in recent times.
Thank you. Can I bring in Dr Claire Foster-Gilbert, Director of Westminster Abbey Institute? Do you share that view that we have a crisis of values? This isn't just, if you like, a narrowly political crisis, but there's a wider crisis here, a moral and spiritual crisis?
I think I would use the word crisis. I think what we have is a situation where the integrity muscle in public life has gone very flabby indeed. And I see this working with all sorts of different public servants, including politicians and civil servants, that even those who have the greatest wish to act with integrity, it's not rewarded. And I think we have to remember just how much hard work a democracy is. Some of you may recall a poll in 2019, which asked people 2 questions. First of all, would you buy a second-hand car from Boris Johnson? Secondly, would you vote for Boris Johnson? And the majority of answers to both those questions was, to the first, no, I wouldn't buy a second-hand car from Boris Johnson. To the second, yes, I would vote for Boris Johnson. So if integrity doesn't count for anything at the ballot box, and remember, if you're a politician in a democracy, you can't do anything without power, then that's not the thing that you're going to be worrying about. And let me also say that when we invite MPs to come for sessions which give them the chance to reflect on the morality of their work and their moral character, we don't comment on policy. A response very often is, I can't come to something with the word morality in the title, because people will read it in one of 2 ways. Either I don't know the difference between right and wrong, and I need to be taught, or I'm climbing onto the moral high ground and I will be pulled down. And we've seen examples of that in the past. The question is, these are just words. Even the Nolan principles, they're wonderful aspirations, they're just words. How do they come to life in individuals? How does this muscle get woken up and exercised? Because it has to be exercised. It is very, very hard morally to be a politician. Your loyalties are pulled in every direction, to your conscience, yes, but to your political party, to your constituents, to your allies in parliament, to the parliamentary party. These are many, many loyalties owed, and you have to decide.
People will understand that politicians by nature are likely to perhaps be more reckless, more chances than the rest of us. It's a crazy life. You could lose your job at any moment. People would criticize you which way or whatever. But the assumption was that actually they are within a structure of civil servants and others who will, if you like, sometimes say, no, Minister, you cannot do that. This is a man. They need guidance. They need help. They need spiritual help, presumably from noble bishops and others. They need a civil service which is rock solid, prepared to say you can't do this. It would help if, of course, the Prime Minister still had an ethics advisor, but he's lost 2 and he hasn't got another one. So you can't just all put down to politicians, can you? Can't you look to those who within the structure of government and say they have to step up too?
Yes, now, that's absolutely right. And thank God we have an independent civil service, or a politically neutral civil service, independently appointed, not politically appointed, which is unusual in the world. So they are also custodians of propriety. But if you have been told again and again and again by the politicians that you're just getting in the way and you're not a believer, this was the language used about Brexit, you're not a believer and that's why nothing's happening, you start to think, well, what can I live with? I've got to tell the minister the truth, give truthful advice. But if he keeps batting me back or saying, come back when your advice has changed because we're going to do this anyway, ultimately your only recourse is to resign. But it has an effect on the institution of the civil service to have this constant battering and being told that you're stopping things from happening because there's such a whoosh of zeal to get things done.
Well, we don't want to be hopeless. We want to have some constructive part of this discussion. What can be done? Is it just up to ultimately the people we elect and what happens at the top comes down? Or is there something else that can be done and that the churches and other spiritual leaders can play a part in? Because what you're describing is a system which is in really serious trouble.
It's not as if we don't have integrity to call upon and to exercise and to work harder with. One place we can start, because we are a democracy, is that we can ask our politicians to have integrity. We can say to them, please would you pay attention to your moral character, because I know how much strain is put upon it by the nature of your work. Please will you give time in whatever way works for you, that you're exercising that moral muscle, so that I know that you're going to continue to try to act with integrity. We can ask that because we elect our leaders. And at the moment, there's not this feeling that if you spend all your time on your moral character, people want you to sort out the dustbins, or get Brexit done. They don't want you to navel gaze. This is what politicians think, MPs think. So they need to know that that's what our electorate wants. I hope it is what the electorate wants. It's certainly what I want.
Can I bring in Bishop John again at this point, Bishop of Salford? This is we know what's going to hit us in the autumn. Whatever. We know the rate of inflation is going to go up dramatically. We know that probably wages won't keep pace. We know people will go hungry. We'll know there'll be fuel poverty. In such circumstances, it's almost classic ground for populist leaders, so-called strongmen. That must be a greater danger now than in many times in recent years. Is this something that you worry about in particular, that we don't quite understand the significance of the economic crisis on particularly poorer people that's going to get worse and worse this year?
Well, I think we're now reaping the effects of what's been a rather poor market economy that we pursued for it, which has allowed the rich to get richer and the poor to get poorer. And we now find that as the fifth most prosperous country in the world, 1 in 4 families are apparently in poverty and things are going to get worse. So it seems to me that political leadership has somehow lost that leadership which listens to the people and their needs. And this levelling up has not been happening. Now, we're a democracy, so what do? We've got to be able to speak out, and we've got to make sure that we're being heard. And that's particularly something that concerns me about the environment, is that we heard a lot of talk at COP26, but it didn't come to very much. Maybe the leadership has not been there.
Okay, the Prime Minister is going to give us a statement and presumably announce his resignation.
It is clearly now the will of the Parliamentary Conservative Party that there should be a new leader of that party and therefore a new Prime Minister. And I've agreed with Sir Graham Brady, the chairman of our backbench MPs, that the process of choosing that new leader should begin now. And the timetable will be announced next week. And I've today appointed a cabinet to serve, as I will, until a new leader is in place. So I want to say to the millions of people who voted for us in 2019, many of them voting Conservative for the first time, thank you for that incredible mandate, the biggest Conservative majority since 1987, the biggest share of the vote since 1979. And the reason I have fought so hard in the last few days to continue to deliver that mandate in person was not just because I wanted to do so, but because I felt it was my job, my duty, my obligation to you to continue to do what we promised in 2019. And of course, I'm immensely proud of the achievements of this government, from getting Brexit done to settling our relations with the continent for over half a century, reclaiming the power for this country to make its own laws in Parliament, getting us all through the pandemic, delivering the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe, the fastest exit from lockdown, and in the last few months, leading the West in standing up to Putin's aggression in Ukraine. And let me say now to the people of Ukraine that I know that we in the UK will continue to back your fight for freedom for as long as it takes. And at the same time, in this country, we've been pushing forward a vast programme of investment in infrastructure and skills and technology, the biggest in a century, because if I have one insight into human beings, it is that genius and talent and enthusiasm and imagination are evenly distributed throughout the population, but opportunity is not. And that's why we must keep levelling up, keep unleashing the potential of every part of the United Kingdom. And if we can do that in this country, we will be the most prosperous in Europe. And in the last few days, I've tried to persuade my colleagues that it would be eccentric to change governments when we're delivering so much, and when we have such a vast mandate, and when we're actually only a handful of points behind in the polls, even in mid-term after quite a few months of pretty relentless sledging, and when the economic scene is so difficult domestically and internationally. And I regret not to have been successful in those arguments, and of course it's painful not to be able to see through so many ideas and projects myself. But as we've seen at Westminster, the herd instinct is powerful. When the herd moves, it moves. And my friends, in politics, no one is remotely indispensable. And our brilliant and Darwinian system will produce another leader equally committed to taking this country forward through tough times, not just helping families to get through it, but changing and improving the way we do things, cutting burdens on businesses and families, and yes, cutting taxes, because that is the way to generate the growth and the income we need to pay for great public services. And to that new leader, I say, whoever he or she may be, I say I will give you as much support as I can. And to you, the British public, I know that there will be many people who are relieved, and perhaps quite a few who will also be disappointed. And I want you to know how sad I am to be giving up the best job in the world. But them's the breaks. I want to thank Carrie and our children and all the members of my family who have had to put up with so much for so long. I want to thank the peerless British civil service for all the help and support that you have given our police, our emergency services, and of course our fantastic NHS, who at critical moment helped to extend my own period in office, as well as our armed services and our agencies that are so admired around the world, and our indefatigable Conservative Party members and supporters, whose selfless campaigning makes our democracy possible. I want to thank the wonderful staff here at Chequers, here at Number 10, and of course at Chequers, and our fantastic prop force detectives, the one group, by the way, who never leak. Above all, I want to thank you, the British public, for the immense privilege that you have given me. And I want you to know that from now on until the new Prime Minister is in place, your interests will be served and the government of the country will be carried on. Being Prime Minister is an education in itself. I've travelled to every part of the United Kingdom, and in addition to the beauty of our natural world, I've found so many people possessed of such boundless British originality and so willing to tackle old problems in new ways that I know that even if things can sometimes seem dark now, our future together is golden. Thank you all very much.
Well, that was Boris Johnson notifying us of his decision to resign, but to remain in office until, at least until, a successor is appointed. And there's an argument going on, of course, about how long that will be and whether indeed that is possible. But let me just come back, if I may now, to Professor Chris Baker. Looking forward now to the task that any leader has, it must be one of the most difficult intrays ever. And I want to pick up that point about the danger of populism again, that if we lose faith in the democratic process and the integrity of those doing it, it's fertile ground for populism. We've seen that in the States. You go back, of course, in the 20th century to Hitler, to Mussolini, and so on. Are you really worried about the autumn and the rise of populism? And this is another reason why we have to work harder and harder to sustain faith in the integrity of our existing system.
Yes, I am quite worried about the continuing shift towards populism, and I do think that it's incumbent upon the new political leaders and the systems, whoever they're appointed, to return to, explicitly to the values and the Nolan principles, which I've written down here: selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership. Because I do think that the problem we've had in this country for some particular time is that our political leaders are sort of mirroring, are sort of embodying the worst aspects of what you might call culture wars.
David Walker has pointed out that, in a recent poll, over a third of UK voters said they would support a strong leader prepared to break the rules. So it's not a theoretical discussion we're having.
I guess it's what breaking the rules means in this particular context. Breaking the rules could actually mean a returning to a kind of resetting British politics and returning to values and principles that we know have stood us very well in previous life. The one sort of part, a bit of optimism that I see is that there is generally, amongst the population as a whole, a lot of evidence to show that people are desperate to restore a sense of values and priorities, beliefs and worldviews, not only to their own personal lives, but also to public life itself. So I've done some very interesting research recently looking at how local authorities and faith groups formed new partnerships around meeting the demands of the pandemic. And what was really interesting was that the basis of these new enhanced partnerships was an exploration of values and the recognition that key values were shared, and those values were things like kindness, empathy, compassion, social justice. So I do think that away from the kind of the heat and noise of Westminster, there is, if you like, on the ground, a kind of willingness to particularly reflect on the pandemic and not return to business as usual, but try and create a new business model that is around genuine empathy, compassion, listening, working together across difference, not reinforcing difference. And the other piece of interesting research that feeds into that is the great emphasis that post-millennials attach to authenticity, their own authenticity, which are, again, values based on, hospitality, openness to others. So the political task, the spiritual task, I think, is to try and connect the grassroots, what's going on at the grassroots, with somehow what's going on with our political discourse.
David Walker, can I ask you to react to that? Or actually, let me put it this way. The new incumbent of number 10, whoever it is, summons you in for a chat, off the record, and acknowledges that worry about populism, but the worry about integrity, and asks you, how do I deal with this? What do I do? What do you say to him? I'm going to ask that awful question to our Roman Catholic bishop as well. But David Walker, what do you say?
I guess it would be about a return to those kind of Nolan principles, a return to seeing values at the heart of everything in terms of making public appointments, in terms of the people who they put in positions of power within government, and ensuring that those are people in whom they have belief, trust in their integrity. And then it's how you set culture. And what the Prime Minister has the opportunity to do is to set culture. And we saw that in how that went so wrong from the Dominic Cummings incident onward through to the parties in Downing Street during lockdown. It's all about culture. And as Prime Minister, you have the chance to reset the culture. I'll be saying to that person, he or she, whoever they are, reset the culture. You can do it. Others have done it before you. Get on with that. Surround yourselves, in terms of the advisors that you surround yourselves, make sure, again, that they are people of integrity and people who are committed to creating that cultural change.
Bishop John Arnold, would you give a similar message if you were summoned into number 10?
Yes, I'm sure I would. One thing, if I may just comment in what the Prime Minister said a few moments ago, there was no question of any fault or default on his part, which I found extraordinary. And I'm not sure he even used the word resign, did he? But anyway, no, I think that there is a culture that has to be rebuilt and they have to be held accountable for. But there's a sense of collaboration for a common end, which is not me obtaining more power for myself, but am I actually in politics to listen to people, to lead, and to create a better society based on the right sort of principles.
Can I bring Claire Gilbert here? There's a sort of vacuum at the moment, inevitably. There will be a leadership contest. It's an opportunity in some ways for you and others to try and steer the conversation in a particular direction and to give confidence to those who want to raise issues of morality, integrity, and don't want to be thought to be, nanny-ish or whatever. What do you think can be done? If we agree that the person at the top has an immense role in setting the standard, what else do you think can be done?
If I were going into number 10, it's not just bishops who go into number 10. If I were going into number 10, and it's not just white men either. Sorry, guys, I know it's not your fault. But I would say, what are you doing to keep your moral muscle active? Because this is not just a word. It's not just a state that you get and then you never change from. It's something that you have to work on all your life. Goodness knows we know about that. We understand this in the church. We understand about formation. It is a lifelong thing. So that's what I would want to know is, what are you doing? And yes, also asking what's the company that you're keeping? But we must understand the place of power in a democracy. It never leaves you. Concern with power will never leave you, even as you want to remember the reason you went into politics, which for most politicians is, I want to make the world a better place. Now, if I might just say one thing about Westminster Abbey, is if you come into Westminster Abbey and you say, I really believe in making the world a better place. Let's say something that you, Roger, might say, well, it's motherhood and apple pie. You would say it anyway. If you really believe it and you say it in Westminster Abbey, it does not sound trite. There's something about creating a space in which you would actually expect people to refer to the better angels of their nature, to quote Peter Hennessy again, to find the better angels of their nature. And that's the sort of work that Westminster Abbey Institute does, is creates that safe context to tell the truth about how good you really genuinely do want to be, given half a chance.
If I can come back again to the Bishop of Manchester, is this an opportunity for you and for the church? This moment, we're going to have an election campaign. I don't know how long it's going to take. Presumably the rules will be set after the re-election of the 1922 committee, not re-election, the elections of the 92 committee. They'll set it. It has quite a long process, as I understood it. Government will be going on. It's an opportunity for you. What are the initiatives that you think, and the Church of England can now take to make sure that, A, the debate does concern itself with the things you think matter, and that candidates have to discuss those issues that you think are most important? What can you do?
I think we're in a good position at the moment because clearly what has happened over these last few days has scandalised so much of the population that I think there's a general recognition that whoever follows the current Prime Minister must be somebody who has a clear moral compass, and who can demonstrate that to those who have the responsibility for electing them. I think we can work with members of Parliament and others to ensure that those questions about character, about integrity, about values, about the Nolan principles are part of national debate. And if we can create the right context for national debate, that will, I'm sure, help in terms of the process. But ultimately, it's the Conservative Party will choose a leader if they happen to choose somebody who is another Boris Johnson. Well, that ultimately is their decision, but that person is likely to be beset by the same problems that Mr. Johnson himself has.
Bishop John Arnold, will you be ringing up William Rees-Mogg, a faithful Catholic, and having a conversation with him? William Rees-Mogg, beg your pardon, that was the father, the former editor of the Times. Will you be ringing up Jacob Rees-Mogg, and a faithful Catholic, and having a word with him?
No, but I think I shall be encouraging people to write to their MPs, to be engaged in as best they can be as the electorate. I think there'll be quite a lot of common statements and about what we believe is sincerity and truth and integrity and where it needs to be. But surely, after the shocks of the last few weeks, there must be in the Conservative Party an assumption that things have got to change, that we've got to put something right here because it clearly has gone wrong. It's damaged the party, it's damaged government, and this is the time to be honest and make corrections.
And finally, we're coming to the end of our discussion. Claire Gilbert, you've just been summoned to talk to the chairman of the 1922 committee. And, of course, he's primarily concerned with the voting and so on. But what would you say to him if you sat down to him privately in a room?
Well, he just has to receive what the mind of the room is.
I mean, in the sense is the chairman of 1922 committee doesn't have a lot of power in one way, but he can certainly raise amongst his colleagues the issues that ought to be at the heart of the decision-making.
Yes. So, all right. So I would say really have confidence to say to your MP colleagues that there is a huge hunger for integrity, for people who will say what they're going to do and then do it, and to look for a leader who is going to take that seriously. Not look for a leader who's perfect, because there isn't a leader who's perfect, but for a leader who will pay attention to that and make that a priority and understand that what they model, the virtues they model, will affect the whole structure. Can I just say to Bishop John, that this is one really powerful thing for the church. And I think of Catholics particularly because everybody gathers every Sunday and you can ask them to do things. You could ask them all to write to their MP and say, please, will you pay attention to your moral character? I know you're not perfect, but I want you to give time to this because I know how hard your job is. I think you'd have MPs weeping in gratitude that their constituents actually told them that that's what they want.
Well, let me put that straight to Bishop John Arnold. You've been nodding. Will you do that?
I'm certainly going to make my clergy aware that this is a very serious thing that they can do, and that we need to participate much more actively in our democratic system. Yes, I think this is a good way ahead.
And last word to David Walker. Will you be doing something similar?
Sounds a very good idea. We can encourage our folk to pray for our parliamentarians, and we can write to our parliamentarians and say we are praying for you, and we want you to think hard about the difficult choices you have to make, particularly those who have votes. Of course, it will be members of the Conservative Party at large as well who will have a say in this, not simply the members of Parliament.
Well, Bishop David Walker, Manchester, Bishop John Arnold, Roman Catholic Bishop of Salford, Professor Chris Baker of the Faith and Civil Society Unit, and Dr Claire Foster-Gilbert, Director of the Westminster Abbey Institute. Thank you very much indeed for taking part in this. Thank you very much also those who've been listening in. And I'm delighted that you did not miss Boris Johnson's resignation speech in doing so. Thank you very much for joining us.